Why do I bring this up? I bring this up because in my quest to understand the role of masculinity in healthy and productive male lives, one of the questions I have to personally face is, do I have to be an athlete? There is almost nothing I would want to do less than join a community softball league. I mean, have me do community theater, I'm all in. So anyway, exploring what it means to be masculine, to be in that 41% of men in America who check 5 out of 5, I consider myself very masculine. To have all the benefits that they have, which this whole series is about, I've had to ask myself, do I need to fix some of that? Just ran my 20 miler ahead of an upcoming marathon in 3 weeks. He says running 20 miles as if he's good at it. I'm not. I'm very, very slow. And that's why you have to train to see how slow you're going to be on marathon day. And the answer is very, very slow. I'm kicking off with this intro, a series of videos that I'm going to do called Run Like a Man. There's no better place to start looking at the question of what it means to run like a man than to examine what it means to run like a woman. And there's no better place to do that than to start with the history of the marathon. The marathon famously refers to the Battle of Marathon, where a runner, a messenger, ran the whole distance from Marathon to Athens to warn of an impending arrival of Persians. This is around sort of 500 years BC. And the messenger evidently collapsed and died, according to one of the accounts. Now, none of these accounts were recorded for hundreds of years afterward, and there's really no historical evidence that this even happened. So, fine. But the lore is such that when the Greeks were ready to reinitiate the Olympic tradition in 1896, in the modern Olympics, they said, let's have the capstone event be the running of the marathon. Now, marathon running was a brand new thing that was being proposed specific to the Olympics. There was no set distance for it. It wasn't the distance from one town to another. They just arbitrarily picked a distance and began this tradition of marathon running. Interesting note, one of the people who ran a marathon in 1896 was a woman. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. Now, 1896, the marathon was a huge hit. Boston, my hometown, decided in 1897 to initiate the Boston Marathon, which is the world's longest running annual marathon. And that whole history of marathons now stretches back that whole distance. And across that history, it wasn't actually until the 1920s, so more than 20 years later, that we actually identified a length for the marathon that would be consistent. That's 26.2 miles. That's what we run today. All right. The really interesting thing about that is that even though in 1896 there was a woman who ran a marathon, women were not allowed to compete in any marathon races. Now, this is not unusual. There weren't actually a lot of women's events in Olympic events or many other competitions. And so there was this general change that needed to occur in believing that women could and should compete in these kinds of events for fear of, I could cherry pick quotes from different people who've said, oh, it'll make them unmasculine. There are these really hilarious, awful, but hilarious comments where people would say if a woman exerted herself to that degree, her uterus would fall out, things like that. Now, let's be fair, coming out of the Victorian era where women had worn whalebone corsets and cinched their waist down to such a light degree, they would often pass out. This was not an unusual thing. And so it developed or reinforced the idea that women, after, let's face it, centuries of being sort of the tough and hardy people who kept the motherland going while the men were out killing each other on the fields of war. And I'm generalizing tremendously, of course. But all of a sudden, come the late 1800s into the 1900s, women are frail. They need fainting couches. They need salts to wake them up after they've fainted because they heard some tragic news, right? There was some cultural growth that needed to occur to just allow women to be tough again. But this all culminated in the marathon being a battleground for this. So most famously, and I'll cut to this image because it's a really great one, the first woman to actually run the Boston Marathon as a registered entrant is Kathrine Switzer. Now, this was in 1967. And Switzer managed to register without making it clear that she was a woman. I can't remember what name she used. As a result, she was able to qualify to get a number 261, which is now famous in Boston Marathon lore, appropriately so. This image here is you see race organizer realizing that a woman is running the Boston Marathon and trying to chase her down and pull the number off of her shirt, and he's furious, and her coach is trying to intervene between them. The coach gets thrown to the ground. The man that you can kind of see off on to the right-hand side, by the way, is Switzer's boyfriend, and he is a hammer thrower. He's like 240 pounds. So he actually intervenes and makes sure that the race organizer doesn't interfere any further with Switzer's progress, and she completes the race. Now, it causes massive controversy. The photo goes viral in newspapers around the world, and it raises the question, this late in the history of the world, can women really run these marathons? When in fact, women had been running them for quite some time. It's not until 1984 that the Olympics actually includes a women's marathon in the Olympics. So it took nearly a century for this to become something that the international sporting community was comfortable with.
Marathon running is just one of those things. It's a little bit like someone who has a sports car. I don't know, pick your hobby. It costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of time. And sometimes you ask yourself, why in the world am I doing this? Especially for me. I am slow. But I'm so inspired by the people who are not slow. Every year that we are able, we spend Patriots Day, the first Monday of April break here in Massachusetts. Now, you will find my family always at mile 15 at a special park where many of our friends and neighbors are also there, whether we're cheering on someone we know, which is often the case, or whether we're just there to practically weep as we see the first runners pass the 15-mile mark. Among those first runners are always the women runners. The women elite runners, as they call them.
Today's women runners are amazing. The original 1896 marathon in Athens, the very first modern Olympics, the man who won completed the marathon in about 3 hours and 20 minutes. I don't remember the exact number. And today's women can do an hour faster than that, which is spectacular. Among our local favorites, Shalene Flanagan, who retired officially from running competitive marathons just a couple years ago after multiple surgeries to replace parts of her body that were wearing out. And then last year, during the pandemic, decided to run 5 major marathons within 6 weeks and basically killed every single one of them. It was amazing to watch. She's one of our local favorites. I'll put up a picture here of her. You can't really see her. Shalane is in the sort of third from the back, if you can see. This is a picture I just took of the elite women runners in 2015. Now, closer to the middle of the pack in black with yellow shoes is Des Linden. Des Linden is another favorite. Not going to say she's a local favorite, but we love her here in Boston because in 2018, facing 35-mile-an-hour icy headwinds and temperatures that absolutely dropped most elite runners, male and female, out of the race, Des Linden went on to win it, the first American woman in 33 years to win the Boston Marathon. So, of course, we love her as well here in Boston. The women elite runners come through first, and they come through first in the Boston for a couple of reasons that are a little tricky, and I want to explain this because when talking with such admiration about what it means to run like a woman, I'm about to say things that some of you are going to feel are critical or denigrating, and I don't think that's the case, and that's certainly not my intention, but you can take things as you want, as people always do. The fact is the women runners have to go ahead of the men quite a bit because the men are going to run the marathon significantly faster than the women. So what happens is if they were to start at the same time, imagine, the elite men would cross the finish line and then 15, 20 minutes later, the elite women would cross the finish line and would essentially be overshadowed by the presence of the men. But there's also a technical reason. Is that if they were able to start with the men, they would draft off the men and have the pacer advantage of having someone pace you at a faster pace than you normally would be able to sustain on your own. And that in international running competition of any distance is not allowed. You're not allowed to have pacers in any of that kind of competition. So men either taking the appropriate spotlight away from the women or the men actually creating a drafting advantage for women, which they wouldn't have in other races. All of that means that the women start first, and they, as a result, are just incredibly fun to watch because they start the marathon. In this particular 2015 event that we were there watching, the weather was sort of average. It was probably a good day, actually, for marathon running. Linden came in fourth. Flanagan came in ninth. It was one of, I think, Flanagan's disappointing runs. She gratefully, 2 years later, was able to go on and win the New York Marathon in the women's category, which was a huge deal for her towards the end of her official running career. And even though it was in New York, we still love her up here in Boston for it. So Linden comes in fourth, and then, of course, just 3 years later, wins it all out. All of it very exciting and just an incredible thing to watch. Why do I bring this up? I bring this up because in my quest to understand the role of masculinity in healthy and productive male lives, one of the questions I have to personally face is, do I have to be an athlete? I've never wanted to be in my whole life. In fact, I could go through the whole history of my experience with grade school and middle school athletics, which I ended before I got to high school. Never really enjoyed team sports. I'm an avid skier. There's things I enjoy doing, but absolutely have zero desire to compete, to be athletic. People would talk about, growing up and being an adult and playing in local softball leagues or things. And I think there is almost nothing I would want to do less than join a community softball league. I mean, have me do community theater, I'm all in. So anyway, exploring what it means to be masculine, to be in that 41% of men in America who check 5 out of 5, I consider myself very masculine. To have all the benefits that they have, which this whole series is about, I've had to ask myself, do I need to fix some of that? So I'm exploring this year a couple of things. I've already launched my investigation in whether or not I need to like baseball, and I'm happy to report just this week the baseball lockout ended, so I'm going to be able to finally start watching some games and following the Red Sox. I've decided I'm going to follow my hometown Red Sox. Why not? I'm going to learn how to hand score a baseball game. So being a fan, I got to learn how to be a fan, which I've never super cared about before either. But do I have to be an athlete? Well, the only category in which I could even call myself anything close to an athlete is running. And this is only something that I've been doing since 2012, and only because I'm trying to fend off being on medication that old men take for the rest of their lives. I'm trying to keep myself healthy purely for that reason, and that's why I started running. I have no desire to compete, and I couldn't possibly compete anyway. But I am enjoying it and have been. So 10 years now, going into 11 years as a runner, you do your first 5K, and then you think, I guess I could do a 10K, and then someone talks you into a half marathon, and you do it, and you collapse on the ground afterward, and you think, I wonder if I could do a marathon. All along, I have a brother-in-law who's trying to persuade me to do ultra marathons, which is something that he's been into for quite some time. That's the background on me thinking of myself as an athlete. Now, is it a manly pursuit? Not necessarily. Doesn't have to be. One thing you have to be, if you want to consider yourself very masculine, is you have to be as healthy as possible. If, for example, if we ask men who are in that 41% of men who consider themselves very masculine, if they have, for example, a healthy weight currently, 79% will say yes. All other men, the number is 56%. Now, it is statistically different. It's not dramatically different in that it doesn't change a lot of life outcomes, but it does change life outcomes. And by the way, I have a history of measuring a whole bunch of personal health characteristics. This one's a very good rough approximation of whether someone is healthy in other ways, is whether they believe they have a healthy weight. I haven't specified what the BMI needs to be or any of that, just do they have a healthy weight. I did not measure in my survey, and I wish I had, whether people engage in any particular sport, whether they do team sports, individual sports, whether they run. In future versions of the survey, I'm going to ask whether they've ever run a marathon, simply because, I think I'm one of the 5% of people in the United States who have run a marathon. And of those people, I am a middle of the pack marathoner. I have lots of excuses for that. My understanding of my biology is that I don't have the sort of genetic lottery didn't fall in my favor. It really does come down to, did genetics favor your oxygen carrying capacity? Do you have the right kind of muscle tissues? Are you able to metabolize nutrients in a way that allows you to feed those muscles while you're running for 2, 3, in my case, 4 hours? I just don't have a lot of those things going for me. Does that make me less manly? Well, actually, among marathon runners, it does. Let me show you what I mean by that. So you're looking at my last marathon performance. This was in October of 2021. It's the Hartford Marathon. I have a really hard time running when the temperature is anything above 55 degrees. And so people have been always suggesting to me, oh, try to run this when it's colder. The Hartford is usually cooler. It's the first week of October. It ended up being 66 degrees, but it started out lower than that, and there was a nice breeze. So it wasn't awful for me. But this one, I was hoping I would break my personal best. My personal best is a 4:11:53, I think. So I ended up with a 4:13:04, as you can see here. Was just, a little bit more than a minute slower. That's a 9:40 pace, meaning that every mile on average I was running in 9 minutes and 40 seconds. Now, for those of you who are real runners, you really are scratching your heads like, James, why do you do this? All right, I'm going to zoom in on the rankings here a little bit. So what you're looking at is there were 1,326 people overall that signed up for this marathon. I finished 618th. So that puts me just barely ahead of the middle of the pack. Now, that's a little disingenuous because some of those people didn't finish. So, I'm probably a little bit behind the middle of the pack for people who did finish. But you'd say, all right, so you're an average of the 5% of people who run a marathon in the United States. You consider yourself in the middle of that block. It's not really a fair way to look at it, especially when I'm comparing myself to other men. I finished 425th out of 761. So that puts me well behind the actual male pace. And I'll just do some math really quick to figure out what that is. 425. Which I could have done before we were talking. I apologize, I didn't. That puts me in the 56th percentile, so I'm behind the halfway point. Now, this is not an elite marathon by any stretch. I think the winner of this marathon in the male category ran a 23 or 24. But anyway, the point is I was running almost 2 hours slower than the non-elite male leads who won this marathon. So, what am I going for in trying to be a better athlete in this respect? I don't know that I'm trying to be a better athlete. And that's okay. One of the things about learning what it means to be manly is accepting that I have certain capacities and certain abilities, and I want to make the most of those. And if it means that my struggle this year is going to be to run under 4 hours, it means I'm going to cheat. So the run I'm going to do, and I'll send you evidence of how I performed, it's in 3 weeks, will be outside of Las Vegas, and it is downhill for 26 miles. In the end, if I claim victory, it'll be, hey, you ran faster than 4 hours, and you took every possible advantage. I'm even going to use carbon-enhanced shoes, which give you a what used to be controversial advantage for marathon runners because it actually absorbs part of the energy of each step and pushes back on your heel. I have a pair of carbon shoes. I did use them at the Hartford Marathon, and it did help noticeably until the rest of my body said, I don't care how fast your shoes can move. I can't run faster than I'm currently running you. So that's all, part of the action. But the question of what it means to run like a man doesn't have an answer, and it doesn't need to have an answer. It's really about what does it mean for this man to commit himself to try to be healthy, to try to improve my health where I can, and learn about my limits in the process, both accepting the limits that I have to be willing to accept and pushing past the limits that I don't really need to use to hold me down or hold me back. That's where I am. I will update you as I go through the year. I just finished, as I said in the beginning of this run, I just finished my 20-miler, which is that long run that everyone dreads as their last long one before they then take a couple of weeks at reduced mileage. The final week before the marathon, significantly reduced mileage to just allow the body to completely heal itself of the trauma of running, and then be ready to get back out there in 3 weeks to run 26.2. I will keep you posted on how that goes.